Welcome to Your Asian Besties, a podcast where we will reflect on our life experiences and what's helping us along the way. I'm Maren.
I'm Ray.
And I'm Leah.
Each episode we talk about a topic unscripted and unfiltered, and this week we're going to be talking about the G word, grief.
Yeah, explain that.
Yes. Why is that? Does that sound bad?
No.
I think.
Continue.
You're thinking. Never mind. I'm not going to even say it.
Yeah, I was like, because I'm thinking of another. Okay, go ahead.
What word are you guys thinking about?
Well, I would say the synonym would be circle.
Circle. Is that what you're thinking about?
No, I don't know. Can you just say? I was thinking of G spot, right?
That's what I thought. But that's not a G word. That's a G spot. Anyway. It's a good way to start this topic. Yeah, so laughing is okay. Like, I just want to say that, talking about grief, it's like all emotions are allowed. It's a messy experience. There's ups and downs. And so, I don't necessarily want this to be like a very somber, serious, chat. I think we're just talking about our experiences and, any resources that have been helping us. But yeah, to set the stage, I lost my mom a little over a year ago, and it was very sudden, and it's probably been the hardest year ever. Like, I thought I've had hard years in the past, but really nothing compares to it. And I think you really don't, it's so individual, like you really don't understand it until you go through it. And even then it's so personal. And so I think this is just about opening the conversation about grief, because we are living in a culture that is pretty grief avoidant. And I think even hearing that word makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And unfortunately, that makes a lot of people feel very lonely in their grief because you don't feel like there's any space for it, And so I kind of want to try to break that stigma a bit. I just want to highlight a few talking points I think that will be helpful in our conversation. I kind of went into grief books and podcasts to try to understand what other people were experiencing, what I might experience. And I think that really helped me in terms of not getting so lost in all of the chaos and all of the emotions, which are often pretty overwhelming at times. And so these are a few things that stuck out, from the books and the resources that I came across. So one of them is that grief is an experience to be tended to. It's not a problem to be solved. And I think that rings so true for me because especially when you lose a loved one, like your primary, caregivers or a spouse or a child even, that grief will never leave you because the love and the grief is so intertwined and it's going to transform over time. And so I think, having that feeling that, it's something I have to get over, it's something I have to totally heal from, it's not really the reality of it, So I think thinking of it in terms of this is just something that I'm going to live with and I have to learn to live with, and it's something that I need to nurture and tend to was a good mindset for me to have. I think a lot of people have heard about the cycles of grief. And I know there's a lot of conversations about how it's not linear, right? So there's these different stages, but you can go through them at all different times. You can cycle through them. You can have, be in different, multiple stages at one time. But the stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And then I actually found another book that talks about how the sixth stage is actually finding meaning, which is kind of helpful in moving on. I think it was really helpful to just have these emotions labeled because it can feel very confusing, to feel the anger or to feel the denial and you feel guilty on top of it because you're like, oh, am I not honoring my loved one? And so just having these laid out, it's like just having that label kind of releases the pressure from it. So yeah, but again, it doesn't have to look any one way. And that, yeah, grief is not a journey with a beginning and an end. It is a language and universal experience we should all become more fluent in, because unfortunately, we will all have experiences with grief. Some go through it earlier than others. But it's one of the hardest things in life. And I just think we should be having more conversations about it. And we should be, I guess, have a better idea of how to support people as well who are going through it. And so I think just like the more we share our stories, the more we can all feel a little bit supported.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, when you said that, I was just thinking about how, like, both you, Marin, and Leah, like, you have both lost a parent. And I am wondering, like, what did that feel like, right? Like, what were those moments of initial grief that you had felt when you lost your parents?
Yeah.
Marin.
Leah, do you want to go first? I feel like we come at it from different perspectives because mine's more
Yeah.
recent. And I'm wondering for you, has it changed over time? Like if you can remember back from the initial earlier days.
I mean, when it happened, so my dad was older. Like my parents had like a almost like a 20-year age difference. And when I was 8 years old, that's when my dad was first diagnosed with cancer, and they did experimental treatments, and he survived. Like he was a cancer survivor. Um, and like like every year he'd still go to like the hospital from time to time, different complications, and hospital visits were the norm. And this particular time that he ended up passing, he was at the hospital. They were just gonna do another seemingly routine thing, like his blood was low, this and that. And I think I definitely felt like it's one of those things where you just like feel it's so normal that you don't expect that this was going to be the last time, right? And I think that was the hardest for me because me and my family were so used to going to the hospital. Like it wasn't like like something's gonna happen. It was just like, yeah, it felt a little bit more serious. And I think that was definitely the hardest. The last moment I remember of him, I guess, being present, and my sister and I go through this still. So the night that he was in the hospital, we all like made our way there because they were going to perform some surgery. So typically they send you home right after visiting hours, but the nurses were nice there and they let us stay in the waiting room all night long. And then my sister and I went to visit him, all took turns. But like around like like midnight, 1 a.m., right? Like he was like all right, like unless he was like put under. So like you never know like if they can hear you, they're conscious or not. But I mean, my dad was still breathing, and we were talking to him, and like holding his hand, and like he squeezed my hand, right? And that's the last I remember of just like that, right? Because then the next morning the doctors came, did the operation, unsuccessful, and then that's when it hit, like that was the last time, right? And then before that, what I distinctly recall was the last time I ever saw him alive, like actually out and about, like was at home. I visited home, and then I remember driving. I was going to make a commute back to San Francisco where I lived at the time. And like the last memory I remember him being alive is like him in the driveway, just like waving bye to me, And like to me, that's always like the memory I treasure the most. I'm going to cry. Yeah. But, it's kind of like, I think it's that. I think it's, you always think back to like when you saw them last. And like to me, it's kind of like, you attach meaning to it, right? Like I'm like you know, like maybe he knew that was the last time and the last memory I would have seen him. So sometimes I think you just attach yourself to like that. And I think of that moment more than I do of him at the hospital. Right. And I think that's what it is, right? You I guess you decide, or you know, like subconsciously decide like how you want to remember them by.
Yeah.
And you know, anyway, so go for it, Maren.
Yeah, it's taking me back.
Tissue break.
Well, I really think, like, I can't obviously speak for, you know, your dad, but I do think that that's how they want to be remembered. You know, they don't want to be remembered for the trauma and the pain and all of that, because their life was something completely, you know, it's something to be celebrated. Yeah, I mean, I feel it's just such a mixture of emotions because it was very sudden for us, and it happened, you know, the day after Mother's Day was when she was taken to the ICU, and we were not expecting it at all. Like, I had just returned from my honeymoon, you know, so I was grateful that I was here. It was a very traumatic, chaotic, dramatic experience. She was in the ICU for 30 days, and I have never been under that amount of stress. It's like those medical TV shows you see, but like times 100, like the types of situations that we would be in. Everything was an emergency. There were so many unknowns. Nobody knew what was happening. And they kept putting her in these very like life-threatening kind of surgeries that they didn't know whether it would work. And we had to make very, you know, of-the-minute decisions. And so it was a traumatizing experience for all of us, and seeing my mom in pain and, you know, but it's kind of like, Leah, what you said, like, I wonder if she had an idea, you know, because one thing was she had decorated the Christmas tree that previous Christmas, and she said, I really love looking at it. I don't want to take it down. So we still have it up, you know, 2 years later, but I think I have an inkling that something might be happening. And we were very lucky because she was able to say her goodbyes to us and, you know, tell us that she was proud of us. And there was someone always there with her. We always spent the night. We took turns. And she was just so, like, gracious throughout the whole process. Like, it's amazing how she handled herself through that. But I mean, on the day of her passing was the day that she was supposed to be discharged, and we thought she was moving on to like a long-term care facility. So luckily we were all there. But it was a nightmare to even have her stay in the ICU. I had to really fight them on it because they kept trying to discharge her, and I knew she wasn't in a state, you know, so having to deal with the insurance and the, you know, uncompassionate medical staff who keep you in the dark, who don't communicate with you, who really treat you like in a hostile, terrible way, like threatening way. That part really pisses me off when I look back on it, like how much I had, and we all had to fight for her just to be treated with dignity, you know. And so I mean, the actual moment was extremely, I happened to be there when her blood pressure started dropping, and it all happened very fast. And I had to kind of call everyone to come, and I just felt so physically sick after. Like, I just couldn't process what was happening. So that's why, like, the grief is a journey is so true, because I think I just was in shock for a long time. And so I really leaned on my spirituality and just being like, Mama's with us in spirit. And, you know, and I was somehow able to do everything I needed to do, you know, around the arrangements and the planning of the service. There's so many things, and I took the lead on that. But in hindsight, I don't know how I did it.
Right.
So I almost think the gravity of the loss is so overwhelming. It basically feels infinite, that you can really only experience it in like bite-sized pieces.
Yeah.
And it's not until you have a little bit of, obviously for everyone it's different, but for me it took time away for me to even remember what had happened in the hospital and to process all of that. And it's all a part of it. I mean, it's just very messy. But I'm grateful for my family that we all banded together. There wasn't any drama in my immediate family. We all came together and we all helped and did what we needed to do. But it is a journey. It's been a year, and in some ways it's harder than not, because there's a certain grief that comes from the distance of time and them not being here. So
Yeah. I think that, when you talk about that, something that it reminded me of is there's a book, Body Keeps the Score. And he kind of talks about how the author talks about how when you are experiencing trauma, like the sense of time is so fractured. And so even when you recall that you were going through a some kind of trauma, like none of them are linear. They are all sort of like fragmented, and they sort of like appear as more of a collage. And so it makes me think like you were literally running on fumes, like you were in survival mode. And so I think it makes sense that you would, I mean, I think in not scientific terms, but I feel like in the scientific realm, like what we consider like dissociation, it's kind of like that connection with spirituality. I think it's when we dissociate from reality that we have access to like the realm of spirituality. And so I think it makes sense for me that you were like, leaning on your spiritual side. And I love that you guys both talk about those moments of um, the the memories of your parents that weren't in the hospital, but it was like, your father saying goodbye, or waving, and like your mom with the Christmas tree, right? And it just kind of makes me wonder, like, how do you guys think you guys like what changed within you? I know this is probably a loaded question. It's a huge question, but what do you think was the transformation um, from like who you were to who you became once you had lost your parents?
you're just changed forever. It's just something that will change you as a person. And it's like there's certain instincts that I feel like I'm so much stronger and more resilient than I ever knew possible, because I've never been in those circumstances before. But it's very trying. It's very lonely, because you're kind of going through this experience and then you're missing the person that you would be relying on for comfort. And it's just, there's so many layers to it, like it's beyond the physical presence. It's like the unconditional love, like all the memories, like so many things like are intertwined, with that person. And so it's really, I think the word integration like feels very good to me, in terms of like, how do I, integrate my mom's spirit and her legacy into my life so that I feel like I can move forward with more meaning. But it's not, yeah, it's definitely not easy. And I feel like I've totally changed. Like, even when I see photos of myself before it happened, like from our honeymoon, I feel like I looked so carefree. And I don't know if I can't go back to that person. And so it's really like what that quote said about just nurturing yourself and being present with where you are and trying to be that caring, loving presence to yourself. But it's definitely tough.
What about you, Leah?
I remember distinctly two things, like, coming home from the hospital. So, like, similar to you, Marion, like, for whatever reason, like, I think the busyness, like, thinking about, like, what happens next, how do we plan the funeral, all that stuff, like I was, like, on top of it, like my sister, like, would, like, go through the feelings more, and, like, I was able to have that clarity of, like, like, let's get this done, this done, this done. And it wasn't until, like, after the funeral I crashed hard. I distinctly remember that. And then I think the other thing, and more of the transformation of losing my dad, was I was going through, and I have mentioned this in past episodes, just a rough time in my life where, like, had, like, a toxic boyfriend, didn't know about my job, didn't know about this. Honestly, the moment that my dad passed, like, I gained so much clarity, and I was like,
Mm.
it got to a point where I was like, I need to cut the crap in my life. Like, I just need to, like, that is not serving me. Like, this is the only life I have. Like, and it was so much easier to prioritize, like, what was important and what wasn't. And for me, like, even today, when I think about that, right, it puts it into perspective, like, why am I, like, so upset or bothered about this little thing, like, like, it it's so insignificant compared to, right, just the gravity of, like, we could all be gone tomorrow, like, honestly, like, does it matter if, like, I'm late on this deadline or whatever, like, and I think it was that, like, like, that same, like, before that happened and after that happened, it's, like, I felt like I just needed to stop wasting time on things that didn't really matter. And yeah, I don't know how else to tell people that. And it's something you can't, like, yeah, I think that's the hardest thing about grief is, yeah, like, I mean, it's such a very, very deep personal experience. Um, but yeah, but I honestly, like, I think the last piece of that is how Marin mentioned, like, like, one of the stages is it finding meaning? Like, for me, that is most definitely where I found meaning, because, um, I finally decided I want to do this for my career. I don't want to be in this relationship. I need to move away from, like, so many things just, like, fell into place. Like, and I don't know. I feel like it was a good thing. Like, it was a good thing, right? Like, I mean, I wish I didn't have to experience the loss of my dad. And also, like, I really felt like I grew up or got that clarity, or, like, really found a lot more meaning and purpose in my own life because of that. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's like a saying in one of the grief books I read that you can take these gifts and lessons and everything, but of course you would never trade that. You would always trade it in a heartbeat to have your loved one
yeah,
back.
honestly, yeah.
But I definitely resonate with everything you're saying. It's just the preciousness of time, and it's just like the everyday stresses are on one level, and then going through the grief and the loss is like just unfathomable. Um, and I think what I realized, like, I really felt my mom's spirit and like her love, and just knowing that the love in your relationships, like, that's all that matters in the end. Like, you hear those things about, think about your obituary, and it's like the money, the titles, whatever, like losing a certain amount of weight, like all these things that we stress about on a daily basis, they do not matter in the end. So it's like when you have that wake up call, it definitely shifts things. Like, I see the world differently. And I think I don't know if Leah, you have this, but I feel like I hear my mom's spirit a lot. I feel like she's with me. And so I think about what she would want for me as well. And that gives me kind of added strength and perspective.
Yeah. For me, it's like the little things, like, now, like, when so my dad loved playing Scrabble, and then, he raised a bunch of pigeons. So like all these things, right? Like now my kids want to play Scrabble, right? And then in addition to just, reminiscing about, playing it with my dad, like I'll actively tell my kids, right? Similar to you, Marion, like with a legacy, like, hey, your grandpa used to love this game and he used to cheat. He used to like go to the room and look in the dictionary, I'm like, don't do that. But it's a good time, like to bring up those things. Or like sometimes I'll see like a white pigeon like fly, and I'm like, oh, like, and it's like the most like random time, and I'm like I'll just think about my dad, or like a song comes on the radio, and it's like those moments where you get reminded, right? I think that's kind of this grief is like, yeah, like fragmented, because then it takes you back. And also like I think the only thing that time, like, so it's been 14 years since my dad passed, almost 14 years. And it's more like your day to day, I guess, things. You think about other things, right? You think less about like that moment of grief. And then the day to day things are more top of mind. But I mean, even now, like, I didn't think I was going to cry, like, talking about, like my dad. But once you're like in that moment, like it's still there, right? It's very much fresh, and it's not like grief has an expiration date or anything. Which, I mean, counter to that, I think that's also where it makes it uncomfortable when it's been such a long time. I think it's hard to bring it up to people because you don't want to make people sad, or and it's such a weird thing. Like then no one just talks about it anymore, right? At least that's how I feel. Like, I mean, I don't mind. Like, I've distanced myself enough. Like, if you bring up my dad, cool. Like, like, yeah, I remember when he used to do that. But yeah, I don't know. It's such a weird thing.
Yeah, there's no timeline on it for sure. And when you think about it, like in terms of the scope of their life, like they were there, they were our whole life. I mean,
Yeah.
they were there for, so many decades. And then so being 1 year out, 2 years out, 14 years out, it's just still there. But I really liked hearing about your signs, because I feel like receiving these signs, like where you just feel this spiritual energy, or I feel my mom, like a lot of times for me, it's like butterflies or coins, or even a lot of times like in license plates, I've seen messages, like I've seen her name, Kimberly, or I've seen her saying with love is forever, and I've seen that on a license plate. And just in certain moments, especially when I need her, I get those signs. And I think that's really comforting to talk about, because like for me, it was definitely an awakening and opened my mind so much in terms of what we can't see, what we can't hear, what we can't, it's like there's so much to it. And so yeah, I'd love to hear more about your signs, Leah, if you've have any other stories.
I guess the other distinct one was I remember having a dream, and I think this was years after I was married already. So I didn't meet Kevin until like 4 months after my dad passed. Um, but I remember having a dream about showing my wedding dress to him, and things like that.
Oh.
And I've had like even dreams like in the last few years where it's like, like I'll be back in my childhood home, and just chatting with him, like everything's normal. And like, even though those are like fake, right? Like they're dreams, they still like give me comfort because it felt real. I don't know how to explain that, but it's kind of like, okay, like, I mean, I grew up as a Christian, so I still believe there's a heaven, and he's like, like watching over us, and, like his spirit is still like alive. But, I think for me, it's like those, like, it's like a feeling like he is present, or that I have that sense that I did when I was actually in the same room with him. That, like for me, like, even if it's not real, it still felt real. And, you know.
Yeah, I totally believe in that, because I think they call them visitation dreams. And I've joined a couple of Facebook groups of like, daughters that have lost their moms and grieving for parents, and I see so many like parallels with the signs and the dreams. And so that's why I love hearing these stories, because I think sometimes they're these very private, intimate moments, but by sharing them, it just feels like it gives it more validity. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Because
Yeah.
I've had dreams as well. Before my mom went into the ER, before I knew about it, I had a dream where my grandma came to me and told me that my mom was dying. I did. I didn't share it with anyone at the time because I didn't really believe it. And then even when my mom was in the ICU and she couldn't no longer speak, I had another dream where my mom came to me and said, "I'm not going to be going to a facility," because we were really, stressed out of trying to find her somewhere good to go that would be able to handle the level of care she needed. And since then, I've had visitations with her too, where she's come to me and we're just spending time together, and it feels very real. And so I really, treasure those experiences.
Something that you guys are talking about is like it's, like Maren, you're comforted by like these signs, right? You're curious about like what are some other signs that that your loved one is still there with you. And I think like in popular culture or in society, we kind of think, oh, like you also mentioned this, Leah, like we don't want to bring up like your mom or your dad or talking about these people because we think, right, that it's going to hurt you to think about those experiences. But it kind of sounds like the more you think about them and the more you are nostalgic about their memories, it seems like you guys feel more connected and feel things. And so, I'm kind of curious, like looking back, do you think that it was more helpful when people, brought like when they talked about your parents when you were going through grief? Or do you think, like what was not helpful? Like what was helpful and what was not helpful that people did while you were going through these emotions and processing what had happened and, going through your grief journey?
Maren, this is more fresh for you, so you can start.
Yeah. I mean, I am one that I think it's like knowing my mom's personality. Like, she wants everyone to keep talking about her. And I never have stopped. Like, even at her memorial service, I left out like index cards, like with pretty pens and stuff, telling people to write their favorite memories of her. And I treasure those things, because I've learned new things about my mom. Like before she was even my mom, like I've learned that she had a size 5.5. She had tiny feet, like 5.5 shoes before she got pregnant. And just, I learned about where my middle name came from. So in talking to her friends and getting these stories, different aspects of her, like it feeds me and it kind of grows my relationship with her even more. And so I think it is counterintuitive. I mean, I guess everyone is different, but for me, like I want everyone to keep talking about her because that makes me feel that she's still, her legacy is living on. And so I still talk about her as if she's still here in a way. Like, oh, my mom, even with strangers, I'll just be like, oh, my mom loved that, or
Oh.
right. Because I think that's what her wish would be. I think what's not helpful is like being too afraid to say anything, like not
Yeah.
acknowledging it. I think that feels very painful. I've experienced that several times, and I can understand where it comes from because you're afraid. You're like, oh, you don't want to make them sad, but they're experiencing it. So just having it acknowledged, and especially like how bad it is. Like I'm so sorry for your loss. It's very like, but it rings very true because it is a loss. So I think when people try to bypass and be like, it's okay, because it feels more like they're doing that for their own comfort.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to deal with your sad feelings, and so I think when it's like that spiritual bypassing of like, you're strong, just move on or whatever, like that feels very invalidating to someone who has suffered a loss. So just acknowledging the person, acknowledging the loss, that would be my advice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What about you, Leah?
Similar. So a couple years ago, I met up with a cousin who I don't see that often, and we had dinner together. And she actually brought up a memory of my dad, like that she remembers visiting her house, and then, like he like snuck, I don't know, like snacks or candy for her and her sister, like while we were at school or something. And it is that like discovery of something I never knew that my dad did, right? And like I love hearing that still. Um, so definitely like yeah, that never gets old. Like and then same with like whenever we have family gatherings, right? When my siblings, will bring up something about, hey, remember when dad used to do this or that, right? I think it's good to have other people like who can bring up those memories, right? Because they miss that person the same way you do, or like at least like with family it's a little easier to you experience the grief together in a sense, so it's not as awkward as like, yeah, a stranger being like afraid to say anything. um let's see, I'm trying to think of like what would upset me now. I get, yeah, I don't, yeah, like I think I've just like learned to accept the fact, right? And because it's, been enough time, there's still that awkwardness when I tell people like, oh, like my dad's already passed. Like, oh, I'm sorry. But it's like, I mean, yeah, you're sorry, but you didn't
Mm.
really know. It's like, I mean, like like it's such a long time. I think, yeah, like I just feel like it's, yeah, so normalized in like a bad way, right? Like, yeah, I think the easiest is like, yeah, when someone can, like is like, oh, like that, I also lost a parent or something, then it feels more okay to share it because like you're not upsetting the other person, or that they're not
Mm.
feeling anything different than you all, would have felt otherwise. Um so yeah, I think, yeah, that's
Yeah, because I think, yeah, the one other thing I think what was really helpful is when my mom was in the hospital, we got a lot of like Grubhub gift cards and, DoorDash
yeah.
gift cards. And those are so great because you're so, enmeshed in all of this stress that you can't even think about eating and showering and all these things. And so my other advice would be like, a lot of people say, tell me if you need anything. But when you're
Yes,
in that
that.
place, you can't do the
You're not
emotional
gonna ask.
labor.
You're
Like
not
you're
gonna
like, nothing
ask.
is
No.
exact. Well, you don't even have the energy to even think what you would need.
Yeah.
So I would just say like, just do it. Like just do acts of kindness, like
Offer
send a
something.
gift
Yeah.
card, like send some food, like just do it. Like, something that doesn't require them to do much energy, like a very low stakes, but just like helping them with those basic things, like the food trains that you hear about, like they're there for a reason and they're really, helpful. So, I think, and it's not to like shame people because I've definitely done that, before I suffered like big losses. I also felt awkward, like I didn't know what to say. And then so you just don't end up saying anything. But even just say, I'm thinking of you, like sending hugs, like on a Mother's Day or Father's Day, or, it's an important holiday, like that's
Mm.
always a good thing. Again, like those low stakes things, like not making them have a heart to heart with you if they are not in the mood, but
Mm.
just like the acknowledgement is such, I think it's so important to the healing because like in some of the grief books they say like that's why having the service, having the funeral, it's a crucial part of the healing process, because having the grief witnessed and acknowledged is really helpful and healing, but then the grief continues long after that. So a lot of times you feel like, you have the support in the moment and then it just trails off, but your grief is still there,
Yeah.
so I think just continually to acknowledge the person's loss and the person that they lost, like, is is important too,
I have
but
a question for both of you. So, I haven't lost, I mean, I lost my grandparents who kind of raised me when I was younger, and I lost my stepfather who I had known for like more than a decade. And, I lost a couple cousins, and I've lost a lot of people who were in my life. But I don't think I was ever able to process those deaths because, in some way or another, I didn't feel like I had the permission, or like it was my responsibility to, I don't know. I don't really have the language around this. But the question that I have for you both is like, how do you even describe what grief is, right? Like, how do you even acknowledge what happens in your body when you experience grief? And I know you kind of talked about like the different stages of it, but I'm just wondering, like, I just don't think I have like a really accurate understanding of how it feels in the body, and like how it feels, how you process something that you don't have language for. And I guess you can like research and read and things like that. Um, but I'm wondering, like, for you guys, how did you even know what what it was that you were feeling? Was it just that like this happened and this is a new experience for me, and so everything that is happening as a result of what happened is part of the grief journey? Or are there like specific emotions or specific things that come up for you that maybe people who haven't processed their grief, like signs that they might look out for that they have unprocessed grief? I don't know if this question even makes sense, but I'm just throwing it at both of you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it obviously depends on, like I said, there's different layers to it. And for me, the loss was so immense that I still can't really process it like
Mm,
fully because it's so overwhelming. Like, I think when you really love someone like that deeply, that the grief is endless. And I remember feeling so heartbroken afterwards, like real pain. Um, I asked my mom to support me. I just like talked to her and can you just support me like in my heart area? Because I feel like it's like almost too much. Like in certain moments, I felt like it was gonna, kill me. Like it just is so hard. And so after I asked my mom for that, I felt like I did feel supported, but it's overwhelming. And I think the trauma does live on in the body because I found that it's been coming up for me, being a year out. Like all of a sudden I'll just feel immense pain and loss, and I don't really know why. And then I'll look at the calendar and it's because I was going through something really hard the previous year, from that time in the hospital. And it just takes so much energy. It's kind of like, I describe it like your operating system. It's like taking so much energy behind the scenes that a lot of people can't see, you know. And so I think just being very kind and compassionate with yourself during that time and just doing basic things like getting up and feeding yourself and showering, like, is a win, because I think it's really like the toughest thing you can go through in life. It really tests your limits as a person. And that's why for me, like relying on the spirituality and the faith and kind of being able to surrender some of that pain um, is the only way I can get through it, you know? And it's kind of like riding these different waves. And, like I said, it's like you feel all the pain from the actual experience of the loss, and then you mourn all of your past memories with that person. And then you mourn all of the future memories that you can't have with them as well. And just so many questions you'd like to ask them. So many things. And so that is ever evolving. And it just requires a lot of self care to get through it, and being able to assert your needs as well. And yeah. What about you, Leah?
I
It's a
was
hard question.
It's a hard
It's
gosh.
indescribable.
Yeah. I was trying to compare experiences. So So yeah, I lost my dad, and then more recently, like 4 years ago, 3 years ago, I lost one of my closest friends. And I think both were similar, like where it definitely hits in waves. Like once again, like I think after like the initial, just like the shock, especially with my friend, because I mean, like she was our age, right? And it's like one of those things you just don't expect, right? It's it was definitely a lot more. Let's see, I think denial and anger,
Mm.
because she had two little ones, right? Two toddlers at the time, and you just think of like she got robbed of that, and like you can't help but feel angry, like why did that
Mhm.
have to happen? So I think that was like different from like my dad, where like he lived a pretty long full life. um and then the last piece, or the other, like trying to compare grief. I had a miscarriage, so I was pregnant a third time. um and similar to you, Marin, there was a time when my daughter, and she was like probably 2 at the time, like actually touched my stomach, like when I was like 6, like 6 weeks pregnant, and did say something to the extent like, she said like, like baby die or something, like she knew. And like I was so freaked out by that, but at the time, like, I mean, everything was like normal and stuff. Couple weeks later,
Oh
like went
no.
to visit a hospital, and like no heartbeat. And like, I think for those two things, like thinking of like the different signs, like, there must be something spiritual. Like this is why I wholeheartedly believe that there's something spiritual. Is like, I think with my miscarriage, it is a lot more like, yes, I get it's normal. Um, yes, like I've lost all those memories, because the moment you know you're pregnant, you have like, all these hopes and dreams, and you're like, oh, like, it's this again, right? And then I was like fortunate enough to not have gone through that before. Like I had, already 2 kids at the time. Um, and I think I'm getting my timelines wrong, because my friend who passed, like she had also gone through her share of miscarriages. So I remember talking
Mm.
to her about the miscarriage, which helped me, And so when I think of those two combined, right, it's like a completely different flavor of grief, like than my dad. I mean, same but different. Um, and a lot of it is just, yeah, I know with like my friend's passing, it was more like anger, like was like the very,
Yeah.
very prominent emotion. And denial, like, this can't be real, like there's no way, like we were just chatting last month about like something she had going on at work. And then with the miscarriage, I think it was more you know just just sadness. Like I didn't work for a couple weeks. I was just waiting for like my body to actually go through a miscarriage,
Mm.
which landed me in the emergency room, right? So it had its own like set of like problems, right? And miscarriage is like common. It's like, 1 in 4 will have a miscarriage. And once again, like that's another grief no one talks about. It's something else that, like luckily I had, a boss who was accepting and understanding of that, and like, was like, take all the time you need, like, like all this stuff. And I think that's, yeah, I mean, what pisses me off too about how we don't talk about grief is like, I think the more you realize people go through these things, the kinder you can be to other people, because
Mm.
you really never know what's going on with someone. Like people can be just literally going through the motions, and you're never going to know that. Um, Right. So it is like this reminder, like we all have like, our things, like whether or not like you've intimately felt grief, like, someone in your circle has felt it. And then, like don't be that that dick, I don't know, that pushes someone over to like the edge, or, just, like, I guess, yeah. So all that to say, like, be kind, because like no one at work knew what I was going through. Similarly, when I found out, when my friend passed, I was in the parking lot about to go to like dinner with some of my coworkers, right? And then only one of my coworkers saw me like bawling in the parking lot, and luckily acknowledged like, hey, like, is everything okay? And then when I shared with him what happened, right, he was like, I lost someone too. And like, like luckily, like I was able to like say something and it wasn't awkward. And he was like, it really sucks, right? And so it goes back to that acknowledgement. So once again, I think it's like, yeah, if you find a safe space or someone is willing to share with you about something that happened, right? Like, like, be kind, like acknowledge it, and know that you have no idea like what they're going through. And then same, like, if you don't know someone's in grief, what's the harm in assuming that everyone is going through something, right? At one point in their lives or another. Um, so yeah, I don't know. It feels the same and different at the same time, which is not helpful to your answer. But
Well, I
yeah.
think, what I distilled from listening to both of you talk about this is that, first of all, visually it looks like, okay, first there's like a huge wound that you incur, and it's like incredibly painful. And not only are you trying to treat that entirely huge, humongous hole and wound that has just happened, but it's also like preventing and exacerbating every other issue that you are concurrently like feeling and experiencing. So like you talked about, Marin, how it's like your operating system completely like slows down, and everything that might have been a little easier just significantly got like really challenging. And then Leah, you talking about how you needed to just like stop working and like give your body the time to first heal and like also emotionally process what you've been through. um and so it just kind of seems like, okay, there's this tremendous tragedy and sadness that you feel around this huge piece of loss. It's like, like a huge branch has been taken away from your body. And then in addition to that, everything becomes significantly much more challenging. And so, yeah, this advice about you being kind, and just kind of assuming that everybody is going through some type of grief is probably a good idea. There's a person on Instagram, JS Park 3000, and he recently had this conversation with Iris Chen about how, grief is ongoing. And like, as soon as you're in the moment, you're in the present, you are grieving the loss of the immediately past moment. And so we're just constantly in these cycles of grief, but they're just that much more challenging when it's like the loss of somebody that you've loved, right, or that you still love. And so I'm wondering for both of you, like, for people who are listening and are like going through grief and are trying to identify what it is that they're feeling, I'm wondering if you have any, like, advice for people who are going through this experience, or who are even like struggling to acknowledge what they're going through, and what kind of resources that have helped you.
Yeah, I mean, I think just give yourself a lot of grace and compassion. And for me anyway, like it was important to be transparent about my loss and what I'm going through. And because it's like such a bird, it's like this huge weight, like this 10-ton weight on your back. And then to have to feel shame on top of it is just unnecessary. It's too much, you know? And so I would just, yeah, just try to be present with yourself and ask yourself, what do you need? And maybe even like lowering your expectations a little bit and knowing that things are not normal. Nobody's expecting you to operate at like the capacity that you were before, because everything changes. There is a fallout, like you were saying, Ray. It's not just the loss of the person, but it's all your dynamics change. there's just so many things. Your whole world is different. And I think for me, there's this period of feeling very untethered and not knowing who you are anymore. And, it's very disorienting. And there's no one right way to grieve. Whatever you're feeling is the right way. And it's really just about holding space for that and being kind to yourself, if you can, through the process, and not making it any harder than it already is. Because I think it really is one of the hardest things that you can go through. And I have some of the books that definitely help me. There's one called It's Okay That You're Not Okay, Meeting Grief and Loss in a Culture That Doesn't Understand. So she definitely addresses that. The author is Megan Divine, and I believe she has a podcast too. This one was really good. And then these are like the ones that talk more about the stages, the On Grief and Grieving by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler. And then the follow-up to this one is the Finding Meaning, the Sixth Stage of Grief by David Kessler. So I find myself returning to these again and again because it's a journey. It doesn't go away. So and I will mention too that there's this great grief group called Asian. You can find them on Instagram, and they're having weekly free Zoom calls. And it's just a place to share and support each other and, play games sometimes. So, yeah, that's a really great resource. What about you, Leah?
Oh, those are all great tips and resources. I think for me too, right? Like because it comes in waves, because a sign will remind you of it, or you hear a song too. Like, I mean, even like writing it out, or like, like I'll call my sister or like my mom and say, like, I saw this sign. And then, I think it opens up the door to just like reminisce with them again. And I think it's finding those safe pockets, right? Like I'll mention it to Kevin, like I had this dream. And I think part of it is just, like kind of seeking to be heard and validated of your grief. And then if you're on the receiving end of that, right, like allowing the person to just, say it, share it, and being a good listener for that. Because and there's no right way to grieve. So however it comes up, or you're, like, I don't think, like Gray, to your point, like, like you can't force yourself to grieve about something, or maybe you are grieving in your own way, right? Like, I think that's what makes it hard to be like, does it feel like this or does it feel like that? I think it's more, like, where is that energy in your body going? Like, how hard is it working to like try and process it? And, like, I think it's all of that, kind of checking in with yourself. Like, am I actually like okay to do this thing? Or am I, like, is it okay to just, take a day off, or, rest a little today, or lean back a little, right? Because we put so much pressure on ourselves to like, and 2 weeks is up, like I'm gonna go back to work, or I'm gonna go back to school, which I did after my dad's passing. Like I was back in my master's program. There were times I had to run to the bathroom because something would trigger me. I was in a sound class, and like someone's sound was like the beeping of like like a heart monitor at a hospital.
Oh,
And
no.
like I ran straight to the bathroom, and it's like, like they didn't know what they were doing, and I didn't know that was going to trigger me. But like there is no like, and I'm done with grief. So I think that's the biggest is, like, if something feels off, or you just don't feel 100%, right? And I think it's with anything like grief or being sick, or your body's telling you something, listen. And I think part of that is just having the awareness that, like, you might not be conscious of it, but like somewhere in you, like you're resisting or you're down about something, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for talking about this really sensitive topic. I know it's it seems like, yeah, it's overwhelming. You're still processing it. And even like Leah, 14 years later, it's still a sensitive topic. And so I love what you said, Maren, in the beginning about how it's not about trying to solve the problem, right? It's about trying to treat it. So yeah, thank you guys for sharing your journeys. If you haven't already, please follow us at Your Asian Besties on social media and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite listening app. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.
Sorry, Maren. I thought maybe I'll just end it there.
Yeah, it's okay. I was trying to scroll back.
Yeah.
No, I think it's an intro episode. I'm sure we have more to talk about.